The decision had already been made. Not publicly, not yet, but the paperwork was done. The budget analysis, the utilization numbers, the efficiency memo that used the word consolidation, where it meant something smaller and harder. 3 days, and the director of the Greater Los Angeles Meal Assistance Program was going to announce the end of the evening service at 4 of the program's 8 kitchen locations. It had the numbers. The numbers were correct. The evening shift served fewer people per dollar than the morning service. The math was not complicated. It had not been inside one of the kitchens since February. It was now October. And on a Tuesday evening at 5:45, a man in a dark jacket and worn jeans walked through the front door of the Elmwood Community Kitchen on South Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles, found a seat at the far end of the second table, and stayed for 2 hours and 7 minutes. He did not tell anyone his name. He did not speak much. He watched. What he saw in those 2 hours could not be found in a utilization spreadsheet. And 3 days later, the announcement was a different one. There is a soup kitchen on South Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles in the Adams Normandy neighborhood called the Elmwood Community Kitchen. It has been in that location for 23 years. The building was a hardware store before it was a kitchen, and the conversion was done carefully enough that you can still see the marks on the concrete floor where the shelving unit stood. Long, pale rectangles against the darker patina of 20 years of cooking and walking. The ceiling is high. The windows along the west wall are original and let in the late afternoon light in a way that was never designed, but has become part of what the room feels like. There are 11 tables. Each seats 8. On a weekday evening, the room fills to about 40%, 30 to 35 people, depending on the season and the weather, and things that do not show up in any data field. In winter, the numbers rise. In summer, when the heat is serious, people sometimes do not walk the distance. The kitchen serves dinner from 5:30 to 7. The menu changes daily. A volunteer named Elena Vasquez, who has been coming every Wednesday and Saturday for 6 years, plans the week's dinners on Sunday evenings at her kitchen table in Culver City. She is 58 years old. She was a food service manager for a hospital system for 24 years before she retired, and she brings to the Elmwood kitchen the same attention she brought to that work. Proper seasoning. Enough protein, something warm that tastes like it was made for the people eating it rather than at them. She had learned, in 24 years of institutional food service, that the difference between food that nourishes and food that merely meets a calorie requirement is not primarily a budget question. It is an attention question. She brought her attention here on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and the people who came regularly had begun, over 6 years, to notice the difference. The room on a Tuesday evening smelled like cumin and roasted tomatoes. The light through the west windows was the long, level light of an October afternoon that had stayed warm past its welcome. There were 21 people at the tables when the man in the dark jacket came in. He took a tray. He went through the line. He said thank you to the server behind the counter. A volunteer named James, who had been doing the Tuesday dinner shift for 3 years and who recognized a first-timer and said nothing. Because James understood that people came to the Elmwood kitchen for their own reasons, and that the reasons were none of his business unless they were offered. The man in the dark jacket carried his tray to the far end of the second table. He sat down, he ate, he stayed. The director of the Greater Los Angeles Meal Assistance Program was named Marcus Webb. He was 54 years old. He had been running the program for 16 years, which was long enough that most people in the city's social services infrastructure knew his name, and long enough that Marcus had developed the specific emotional condition that long-term administrators of under-resourced programs develop when they care too much for too long, without the tools to do what the caring requires. He had come into public service at 32 from a background in nonprofit management and a belief genuinely held at the time that systems could be improved if the right people were paying attention. He had improved some things. He had changed some numbers. He had written proposals that were partially funded and expanded programs that were subsequently cut and made the case annually, to budget committees that were sympathetic and unhelpful in equal measure. A had grown up in Compton. His mother had worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood, days at a laundry on Wilmington Avenue, evenings at a grocery on Central. She had never used a food assistance program. She would not have called it pride. She would have called it getting by. He had understood, even as a child, That the distance between where his family was and where they needed to be was maintained by a combination of her effort and a very thin margin, and that the thin margin was the thing that frightened him. He had spent 16 years trying to make the margin less thin for other people. He had also spent 16 years watching politicians use the program for press releases and then fail to fund it. Watching the number of people who cycled through the doors and came back unchanged because a meal was a meal and not a solution, and he had never had the budget to provide anything more than a meal. Watching the people beneath him in the organization burn out at a rate of nearly one per year. It had developed, in response to all of this, a quality that he called efficiency, and that was, underneath that word, something closer to distance. He reviewed the numbers. He made the decisions the numbers supported. He stopped visiting the kitchens because visiting the kitchens made the numbers feel different, and feeling different about the numbers made it harder to make the decisions the numbers required. He had not been inside a kitchen since February. He had been inside a conference room in February, reviewing the utilization data that would eventually produce the consolidation memo. The data was accurate. The evening service at 4 locations was serving an average of 30,000 people per night at a cost of $18.40 per person, compared to the morning service's average of 67 people at $9.80. The math was not complicated. What the math did not contain was Harold. Harold Stinson was 74 years old. He had been coming to the Elmwood kitchen for dinner every Tuesday and Thursday evening for 2 years and 4 months. Before that, he had been coming on Tuesday evenings only. Before that, he had not been coming at all, because he had not known the kitchen was there. Because the years in which a man knows everything about a neighborhood and then loses track of it and then finds himself back in it can span a long time. He had grown up 12 blocks from the Elmwood kitchen. He had played on the corner of Vermont and Adams as a child in the years when the hardware store was still a hardware store and the neighborhood was the neighborhood it had been then. Not easy, exactly, but held together by the specific social density of a block where everyone knew whose children were whose. He had enlisted at 17. He had come back at 19. He had spent the intervening years in Korea, and in the particular silence of a young man who has seen things he does not know what to do with, and has come home to a country that has moved on. He had worked for 41 years as a parts manager for an auto supply distributor in Hawthorne. He had been good at the job. He had a memory for inventory, for the exact location of a part in a system of 40,000 parts, that his colleagues had noted and that he had quietly taken pride in. He had been married for 33 years to a woman named Claudette, who had died of pancreatic cancer in 2019 after 6 months of a diagnosis that gave them time to say what needed to be said, which was something Harold held on to, rather than the speed of the illness, because holding on to the right thing was the skill the years had required of him. He had a daughter in Riverside who called on Sundays. He had a studio apartment on Budlong Avenue that he kept the way he had kept his inventory, precisely, without excess, nothing out of place. He came to the Elmwood kitchen not because he could not feed himself. He could feed himself. He came because the evening, without the kitchen, was a long thing to fill alone. He came because Elena remembered how he took his coffee, and because James, who worked the Tuesday dinner shift, had learned over 3 years to put the roasted tomato soup at the front of the serving tray without being asked, because Harold always chose the tomato soup when it was available, and James had simply started making the choice easier. It came because being known, in the small ways that a room can know a person, was a thing that mattered more at 74 than it had at 40, and that the Elmwood kitchen provided in the specific form available to it. He had no idea that this provision was 3 days from ending. The man in the dark jacket sat at the far end of the second table and watched Harold eat. It did not stare. He was not obvious. He was the way people are when they are paying close attention and have learned to do it without making the subject aware. Harold ate the tomato soup slowly. He had a habit of breaking his bread into 4 pieces before he began, which he did every time, which the man noticed. He talked to the woman seated to his left, a younger woman, early 30s, with a child on her lap who was eating crackers, for about 8 minutes. It talked to James when James came around with the coffee. A brief exchange that ended with Harold laughing at something, a short laugh, genuine, the kind that sounds like it surprised even the person who produced it. At one point, Harold looked up from his tray, and his eyes passed across the far end of the second table and rested for a moment on the man in the dark jacket. And the man nodded, Not a greeting exactly, who's an acknowledgement of shared space, the kind of nod that says, I see you and I do not require anything from you. And Harold nodded back and returned to his soup. The man stayed through the dinner service. He watched the room the way you watch a room when you are trying to understand something that the numbers describing it cannot tell you. He watched Harold finish his soup and his bread and his coffee. He watched Harold speak to Elena at the serving counter before he left. A longer conversation, 2 minutes, the kind of conversation that had a history to it, that was not starting from nothing. He watched Harold put on his jacket and button it all the way to the collar against the October evening. He watched Harold walk to the door, hold it for the woman with the child who was leaving at the same moment, and go out into the dark of South Vermont Avenue. He sat at the second table for another 12 minutes after Harold left. Then he got up. He cleared his tray. He thanked James at the counter. He went to find Elena. She was in the kitchen, in the back, running the dishwasher rotation the way she ran it every Saturday and Wednesday, efficiently, with the particular organized attention of someone who has done something long enough to do it automatically and has chosen to keep paying attention anyway. It came to the kitchen doorway and knocked on the frame. She turned. She looked at him for a moment with the straightforward assessment of a woman who has been doing this work for 6 years and has learned to read a face fairly quickly. She said, "You were at table 2. He said, "Yes." She said, "First time." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm fine. I just wanted to ask about the man who just left, the older gentleman. I want to make sure I am understanding what I saw." She looked at him. She said, "Harold," he sighed. "Tell me about Harold." She did. She told him about the 2 years and 4 months, the Tuesday and Thursday routine, the daughter in Riverside. She told him about Claudette. She told him about the way Harold broke his bread into 4 pieces before he started, which she had noticed in the 3rd week, and which she had never asked about. She sighed. She thought it was just the way he had always done it. Some things a person does because a person they loved once did it, and then it becomes the way they do it, and then it is just theirs. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "The evening service." She went still. He said, "You know about the consolidation proposal?" She sighed. "I wrote 2 letters. I was told the decision was under review." She paused. "It is not under review." He said, "No." She said, "The announcement is Thursday." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "Who are you?" He said his name. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You came and sat in the room." He sighed. "I needed to understand what was here before I tried to say anything about it." She said, "And now you understand." He sighed. "I think I understand Harold. I cannot pretend to understand everyone in this room. But Harold is enough." He said it simply, not as a figure of speech, as a precise description of what was true. He called Marcus Webb at 8:45 the next morning. Not his assistant, not a deputy. The director's direct line, which he had found through a mutual contact who worked in the city's Housing and Human Services Division, and who had, when asked, provided it without asking why. Marcus answered on the second ring. He said his name. Keanu said, "I was at the Elmwood Kitchen on South Vermont last night. I sat through the dinner service." Marcus was quiet. Keanu sighed. "I would like to ask you one question, and then I would like to ask if you will meet me there." Marcus sighed. "I know who you are. I also want to be clear that the program's funding decisions are made on the basis of," Keanu said, "I know, the utilization data. 21 people per evening at $18.40 per person versus 67 people per morning at $9.80. I have seen the numbers." A pause. Keanu sighed. "When did you last sit down inside one of these kitchens? Not a site visit, not a review. Sat down at a table and stayed through a meal." Marcos did not answer immediately. Keanu sighed. "I am not asking to embarrass you. I am asking because I think you already know the answer, and I think you know what it means." A longer pause. Marcus said, "February." Keanu sighed. 8 months. Marcus said nothing. Keanu said, "There is a man named Harold Stinson who eats at Elmwood on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He is 74. He served in Korea. He has been coming for 2 years and 4 months. He comes because the room knows him, not the program. The room." He paused. "I would like you to come and have dinner with him on Thursday before you make the announcement. Not as a director, as someone sitting at a table. Marcus sighed. The decision has been reviewed thoroughly. The numbers? Keanu said. I know what the numbers say. I want you to look at something the numbers don't say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am not asking you to change the decision. I am asking you to have dinner with a 74-year-old man before you make it. That is all. Marcus Webb was quiet for a long time. S sighed. Thursday evening. S sighed the way a man says something when he has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just decided to put it down for a moment and see what it feels like to stand without it. They sat at the second table. Harold, Marcus, Keanu, and they ate dinner. Harold did not know who Marcus was. He was told he was a colleague of the man he had nodded to on Tuesday, which was true enough. It had the tomato soup, which was on the menu again, because Elena had checked the schedule when she heard who was coming and made a quiet adjustment. He broke his bread into 4 pieces. Marcus watched him do it. Harold noticed Marcus watching. He said, My wife used to do it this way. I picked it up from her. Now it's just how I eat bread. Marcus said, How long were you married? Harold said, 33 years. Marcus said, And she? Harold said, 2019. Marcus said, I'm sorry. Harold said, Thank you. He picked up a piece of bread. She would have liked this place. She liked a room with people in it. She said an empty room was a room that hadn't figured out what it was for yet. Marcus was quiet. He looked at the room, the 11 tables, the west windows, dark now at this hour, but the light still on inside, and through the glass the shadow of a neighborhood going about its evening. He looked at the pale rectangles on the floor where the hardware shelving had stood. He looked at James moving through the tables with the coffee, unhurried, precise, knowing which cup was whose. He sighed to no one in particular. I haven't been in one of these rooms in 8 months. Harold looked at him. He said, That's a long time. Marcus said, Yes. Harold said, Well. He dipped the bread into the soup. You're here now. The announcement, on Thursday, was not the one that had been drafted. Marcus Webb spent Wednesday afternoon and Wednesday evening rewriting it. He did not cancel the consolidation. He had not found the money to cancel the consolidation. The money was not there to find, and manufacturing a reversal from nowhere would have been dishonest. What he did was different. He postponed the evening service closure by 90 days while the program sought bridge funding. He committed to a community review process in which the actual users of the evening service would be consulted before any final decision. And he submitted a request to the City Council's Social Services Subcommittee for an emergency budget review, citing utilization data he had been using incorrectly. Not the numbers themselves. The numbers were correct. The framing. He had been measuring the evening service by its volume and not by its function, and those were not the same measurement for a service whose primary value was not throughput but continuity. The budget review was granted in November. The evening service remained open while the review was conducted. Marcus began going to the kitchens on Tuesday evenings. Not all of them. He rotated. 3 kitchens over 6 weeks, 1 evening at each. He sat at a table and ate dinner and stayed until the service ended. He did not announce himself. He did not conduct reviews. He simply came the way you come somewhere when you have decided that being present matters more than being informed. His deputy director, a woman named Claire Obuobi, who had been running the program's day-to-day operations for 4 years and who had been quietly keeping the trains running, while Marcus managed from a distance, noticed the change within 2 weeks. She said, in their Friday check-in, You seem different. He said, I went back inside. She said, I know, I saw the Tuesday logs. He sighed, Did anyone say anything? She said, James at Elmwood said, You knew how to clear a tray. He looked at her. She said, That's a compliment from James. He said, I know. She sighed. What changed? He thought about Harold breaking his bread into 4 pieces, about the pale rectangles on the floor, about a room that hadn't figured out what it was for yet. He sighed. Someone made me go look at something I had stopped looking at. She said, Who? He said, Someone who sat in a room for 2 hours and paid attention. The bridge funding came through in January, a private contribution, the specific source of which was not publicized, routed through the program's established foundation arm in a way that preserved the program's administrative independence. The amount was $340 million, which covered the evening service at all 8 locations for 14 months, while the budget review worked through the city's process. The budget review was completed in March. The City Council's subcommittee recommended a 22% increase in the program's evening service funding, citing the community review's findings that the evening service functioned differently than morning services, not as a meal delivery mechanism, but as a daily community anchor for a specific and identifiable population of isolated elderly and transitionally housed residents, for whom the alternative to the kitchen was not another kitchen, but nothing. The increase was approved in April. Marcus Webb testified at the Budget Committee hearing in March. He brought one piece of supporting material that was not in the data package his team had prepared. It was a single paragraph he had written by hand, on a plain notepad, the Tuesday evening he had dinner with Harold Stinson. There is a man named Harold who breaks his bread into 4 pieces before he begins his meal, the way his wife used to do, who has been doing this alone since 2019, who comes here twice a week because the room knows him. He has served his country and worked 41 years and loved one person for 33 years and lost her. The program costs $18.40 per meal to serve him. There is no way to put the other things in a budget document. There is also no way to remove them from the decision. He read it aloud. The committee chair, a woman of 61 who had served on the council for 14 years and who had approved more budget cuts than she could count, looked down at the table while he was reading. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Let's talk about the increase." Elena Vasquez found out about the private contribution in February from Marcus, who told her in the kitchen at Elmwood on a Wednesday evening while she was planning the following week's menu. He did not tell her the source. She did not ask. She said, "Is the evening service safe?" He said, "For now." She said, "For now is different than before." He said, "Yes, it is." She looked at him. She sighed. "You came back." He said, "I came back." She said, "That matters. I want you to know that. Not the money and not the review. You coming back to the rooms and sitting down." He sighed. "A man sat in this room for 2 hours and paid attention. I figured I could do at least that much." She went back to her menu planning. I watched her work for a moment. The same focused attention she brought to every decision, the determination that the food would be made for the people eating it rather than at them. Then he picked up a dish towel and said, "Tell me where you need help." Harold Stinson ate dinner at the Elmwood Community Kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday evenings through the winter and into the following spring, the same as he always had. Elena still put the tomato soup at the front of his tray on the weeks it was on the menu. James still knew his coffee. He still broke his bread into 4 pieces. On the first warm Thursday of April, Harold stayed after the dinner service for 20 minutes to help Elena stack the folding chairs along the east wall, which was not something he had ever done before. She did not ask him to. He simply saw it needed doing and did it. When he was done, he put on his jacket, buttoned it all the way to the collar, out of habit even though the evening was warm, and walked out to South Vermont Avenue. He walked the 12 blocks home. The neighborhood had changed a great deal since he was a child, and it had also stayed the same in the way that neighborhoods stay the same. The same distances between corners, the same slope of the ground toward the east, the same quality of light from the westward horizon on an evening in April. He had been walking these blocks for most of his life, in one direction or another. And he knew them the way you know something, when you have known it long enough for it to become part of how you understand where you are. He went inside. He made tea. He called his daughter in Riverside, and they talked for 22 minutes, longer than usual, about nothing in particular. Her work, his week, a memory about Claudette that came up the way memories come up. Without announcement, just there suddenly and worth following. He hung up. He washed the cup. He went to bed. I have been thinking about the distance between a number and a person, not in the abstract, in the specific. The distance between 31 meals per evening at $18.40 per meal and Harold Stinson, who breaks his bread into 4 pieces the way his wife used to, who comes on Tuesdays and Thursdays because the room knows him, who walked 12 blocks home in April and called his daughter and made tea. Marcus Webb was not a bad man. He was an administrator who had been doing difficult work for 16 years with insufficient resources and insufficient support, and who had, in response to the accumulated weight of that, moved away from the rooms and toward the numbers. This is not unusual, This is what happens when caring becomes unsustainable at the level it is required, and the only available adjustment is to care differently, which eventually means caring less specifically, which eventually means the number and the person stop feeling like the same thing. What Keanu did was not complicated. He sat in a room for 2 hours. It paid attention to one person. And then he called the person responsible for the room and asked him one question. When did you last sit down inside one of these kitchens? Ed did not answer the question for Marcus. He asked it and waited. The asking was enough. I think about Elena's letters, two of them, written carefully describing what she had seen over 6 years, sent to the right address, answered politely and without result. The letters were not wrong. They contained the same information that changed the decision, but they arrived at a desk rather than at a table. And there is a difference between reading about a room and sitting in one, and Marcus had needed to sit in the room before the information could become real. I think about Harold, who does not know most of the story, who came to the kitchen on Thursday evening in April because it was Thursday and this was where he came, and who stacked chairs because it needed doing, and who walked home in the warm evening air and called his daughter because that was the kind of Thursday it was. I am not sure he would describe what the kitchen gives him as extraordinary. I think he would describe it as a room that knows him, as a place where someone remembers how he takes his coffee and puts the tomato soup at the front. That is not very much. That is, for some people, everything. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known practice of going to places quietly, staying long enough to understand what is actually there, and then doing the specific thing that the situation requires, rather than the general thing that would be easier. If something in this stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me the specific moment, not what the story was about. What it made you see differently. That is what I carry away from stories like this. 1. And I am always curious what you carry away. If you know someone who has been doing important work for a long time and has slowly moved away from the rooms where the work happens and toward the numbers that describe it, share this with them. Not as a critique, as an invitation to go back inside. Subscribe if this is the kind of storytelling that earns your time. One story, every week, told as carefully as I know how. See you in the next one.